Every generation seems to believe it's facing some new social threat. A group framed as dangerous, confusing, corrupting, a threat to children, a threat to society. And every time, the pattern starts looking strangely familiar. Because moral panic usually does not begin with evidence. It begins with fear, with uncertainty, with emotion, and maybe most importantly, with simplification. Because complex people are difficult to fear. Simple caricatures are not. And once society starts reducing entire groups into symbols of danger, panic spreads fast. Not because people fully understand the group they fear, but because fear itself simplifies the conversation. And history shows this pattern repeating again and again and again. Because moral panic tends to follow a structure. The term moral panic sounds dramatic, but the idea itself is actually pretty simple. A moral panic happens when society starts treating a group, behavior, or social change as a major threat, even when the evidence does not fully support the level of fear. And importantly, that is not the same thing as ordinary concern. People should ask questions. Societies should debate social change. That part is normal. Concern becomes panic when fear starts replacing nuance, when complexity disappears, and emotional reactions become more important than understanding. Because a moral panic does not require a threat to actually be widespread. It just requires enough people to feel threatened. And once fear becomes emotional enough, facts stop driving the conversation. Narratives do. Symbols do. Headlines do. And emotion does. And that is usually where the pattern begins. Most moral panics need something very specific. An outsider. A group that can be framed as different, unfamiliar, disruptive. Sociologists call this a folk devil. A person or group symbolically turned into the source of broader social fears. And history is filled with examples. Immigrants framed as corrupting society. Gay people framed as threats to morality. Religious minorities framed as dangerous. Women entering public life framed as destroying the family. Even completely fabricated threats, like the satanic panic of the 1980s, followed the same structure. Fear needs a target, because uncertainty is uncomfortable, and humans naturally try to simplify discomfort into something concrete. Someone to blame, someone to fear, someone to control. And the less familiar a group is to the general public, the easier it becomes for stereotypes to replace reality. Because most people do not fear what they understand. They fear what they have been taught to associate with danger. And this is where moral panic becomes powerful. Because panic survives through simplification. Real people are complicated. Groups are diverse. Communities are messy. But panic reduces all of that complexity into emotionally charged symbols. One story becomes the entire group. One clip becomes the entire movement. One anecdote becomes proof of societal crisis. And emotionally powerful examples spread much faster than nuanced explanations ever will. Especially when children become part of the conversation. Because very few phrases shut down critical thinking faster than think of the children. And to be clear, protecting children matters. The concern is real, but emotional urgency can also bypass careful thinking. Because once fear becomes attached to children, people often stop asking whether the threat itself is being represented accurately. And this pattern repeats constantly throughout history as well. A society becomes anxious, a group becomes simplified, a narrative becomes emotionally charged. And suddenly the public conversation becomes less about understanding people and more about reacting to symbols. One of the most misunderstood parts of moral panic is visibility. You will often hear people say things like, "Why is this suddenly everywhere?" Or, "These people didn't exist when I was young." But usually the group was already there. What changed was visibility, and visibility changes something important. It forces people to acknowledge groups they may not have thought much about before, sometimes for the first time. And that can feel uncomfortable for people who are used to certain social norms feeling automatic or unquestioned. Not necessarily because society is collapsing, but because change itself creates discomfort, especially rapid social change. And that discomfort often gets misinterpreted as danger, which is why visibility itself frequently gets framed as pushing an agenda. Not because visibility is inherently harmful, but because normalization changes what society considers standard. And moments of normalization often trigger backlash before acceptance. And history shows this pattern constantly as well. Visibility increases. Public anxiety rises. Media attention amplifies conflict. And suddenly, a minority group becomes framed not as people, but as a social issue. And this is the important part. Moral panic is not just about one group. It's a broader social pattern. Fear spreads quickly during periods of uncertainty, especially when societies are changing quickly. People look for explanations. Media benefits from emotionally charged stories. Politicians benefit from identifying threats. Communities try to protect familiar norms. And slowly, complex social changes become simplified into emotionally satisfying narratives. Good people versus bad people. Safe people versus dangerous people. But reality is almost never that simple. And once a society learns to reduce human beings into symbols of fear, it becomes much easier to justify exclusion, restriction, control, and sometimes way worse. Because panic changes the way societies think, not just the way they react. The danger of moral panic is not simply that people become afraid. Fear is human. Fear happens. Fear is natural. The danger is what fear does to perception. Because once fear becomes stronger than understanding, people stop seeing groups as people. They start seeing symbols, threats, warnings. And history shows how dangerous that can become. Not because every concern is fake, not because every social debate is meaningless, but because panic has a way of flattening complexity into certainty. And certainty built on fear is often one of the fastest ways societies stop listening to each other. Because once a culture learns to simplify people into threats, it rarely stops with one target. Y'all be well, and I'll see you in the next one.